with your business podcast, how do you measuring the growth of a podcast or the success of a podcast?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does kind of depend, but I think there's some frameworks that are common throughout it all. So I think at the end of the day, you just have to have clarity on what the goal is of your podcast.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people, they're measuring their podcast success solely based on downloads. And that can be one measure of success. So I think it's really important for people to know what type of podcast you're creating. In my experience, it's usually one of three things. Either the podcast is your business, which if the podcast is your business, then the business model is to grow the show, grow downloads, get and monetize directly, whether it's through like sponsorships or premium memberships or something. So that's if the podcast is the business. If the podcast supports your business, which is that's the realm that most of our shows are in, then you have a business on the back end. And the idea is that the podcast would either bring new people in or it would serve to like help nurture your current audience. And then the third would be it's a hobby, which is it's for fun. Like right now, your guys' football podcast, like I know you have aspirations for it to be a big podcast and to make money off of it. But like right now it's like a hobby. And so like right now, like I would say like for a show like that, are you guys having fun?
Hell yeah.
Does your audience like the content? It's like, that's probably like the most important thing to start with it.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of times people maybe have a hobby podcast, but they're judging it. They're comparing themselves to podcasts where the podcast is the business. Like, your Spotify, your Wondery shows. So I think it depends. There's like different metrics in all of those things. So if it's the business, downloads. If it's supporting the business, you probably want to have a clear connection to actual like revenue or retention for customers. And if it's a hobby podcast, then like you still want to see an increase in downloads because you still want to see some metrics like going up because that means you're creating good content.
Yeah.
So I think it does depend a little bit case to case, but I think there's kind of these buckets that a lot of people don't really have. Like sometimes I think we confuse what purpose our podcast actually serves.
Yeah. And I think to illustrate this, right? Like when the podcast is the business, we're talking somebody like Joe Rogan, for example, right? That they make their money from sponsorships and all that stuff, right? And when we talk about supporting, like you said, is kind of like how we do it for our podcast, right? We have our service that we offer. I think is how you do it. I know your current podcast, I think it's in pause. You're restarting it soon, but you have your agency and that is your business and you're bringing in either leads, connections, or you're building your network throughout the podcast. That's kind of how we do it. And through the network, then, you get some really cool connections in there to work together with.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Absolutely. I think it comes down to clarity. Like and particularly with people that you and I work with, where usually businesses or creators that have some kind of like business connected to what they're doing.
Yeah.
And I think that you just have to know like what purpose does the podcast serve? For me, I look at podcasting a little bit more like middle of funnel than top of funnel.
Same.
And I think a lot of podcasters start the podcast. A lot of businesses start a podcast thinking that it's top of funnel.
Yeah.
So they're like, this is going to be the silver bullet that grows my business. When in reality, it's more of like a middle of funnel. It's like more of a place where you're funneling your current kind of like fringe audience into, and it's giving them more touch points with your brand. So I think the important piece to know, like, how do we define success? It kind of starts with knowing like where the podcast fits in your current like ecosystem of your brand.
So extend a little bit on that, because when you say people think it is more top of funnel, right? What I have the same thought as you. I believe it is more middle of the funnel. And when we have conversations with people that they're like, I want to get clients and I want to build an audience through podcasting. And I'm like, right, well, when do you need them? Right. And it's like yesterday, right? You're like, maybe podcasting is not the right thing for you, right? It's, there's a big challenge for discoverability, especially if, you might be a business or a podcaster that might not be able to pour as much resources, right, in the marketing of the podcast.